Therefore, it will be as it has never before been, that you human beings will judge according to your blood and belief, that you as parents will cast out your own children, and you as adults and young people will cast out the aged. And you will increasingly close your eyes to crimes that occur in your sight, to rapes of helpless and defenseless women, to sexual abuse of children, as well as to evil and often fatal Gevalt acts against your fellow human beings who are old, handicapped, weak and vulnerable. Increasingly, all kinds of human achievements will be deliberately and maliciously destroyed, plundered and robbed. Deceitfulness will be practiced, and more lies and calumnies will prevail as well to your own advantage. The greed for profit amongst those of you who control the use of foodstuffs, their planting and processing, will lead to more and more hungry people joining the population of Earth, and it will be terrible to see the bones of the starving projecting through their skin, and how their wounds will fester, separate and be attacked by vermin. And it will become ever more terrible how many of you human beings will be riven, harried and killed like harmful game, whilst many others will flee and lose their lives in many ways during their flight. And yet, as is already the case today, the majority of you human beings of Earth will not pay any heed, because you turn your face away from the suffering of the refugees and do not do anything to enable them to live in their homeland, work and lead a life of dignity. Increasingly, you will only look after yourselves, and you will only be able to assuage your guilty conscience by giving small donations to the poor and suffering, although your real motivation will be for everyone to think that you are a good person and you receive the small donations back many times over. Truly, the price of a human life is becoming ever cheaper, and more trafficking of human beings as slaves is going on, whether as slave workers, for prostitution, in the mercenaries, or for organ trading, for the purpose of which healthy human beings amongst you are abducted, kidnapped, sold and slaughtered like livestock, to be robbed of your viscera, organs and body parts. And all of the people amongst you who are greedy for profit, you who conduct this sort of trafficking or are yourselves murderers, slaughterers and butchers of carcasses, you will fight even over the blood of your murdered victims, just as you would over their skin and bones. And this has already become so commonplace at this time when the third millennium is opening, and therefore things will get very much worse in this way in the time to come. And human trafficking will not only be performed increasingly with adults, specifically with young women for the purposes of prostitution, but also with men for the purposes of slave work, as well as with children who are put to work and sexually abused by pedophiles. And everything is becoming more and more commonplace in this form, just as the inviolability of your human dignity is being increasingly disregarded and forgotten. Therefore, it will be that you human beings of Earth will become increasingly brutalized, unscrupulous, and will lapse further and further into savagery. Lying and deception will rule the world to an increasing extent, namely through the beggars amongst you just as much as through those of you who live as good citizens in normal and good prosperity, and this will be the case right up to you rich and ruling people. Therefore, as never before in the history of earthly humanity, lying and deception as well as deceit, falseness and calumny as well as servitude through government will be held as the truth, and an ever greater calamity will be built upon it. And it will be increasingly the case that you people will be treated like animals for the slaughter, implanted with electronic data chips by means of which you will be controlled and robbed of freedom by authorities, public offices and governments, although in your ignorance you will think that you live as free people, although you are in fact servants of the governments. In this way, public authorities, official bodies and those in government will rule over you in a way that has never happened before, meaning that you will no longer chart the course of your own fate in the collective, because this will be done by those who exercise total power and control over you. In this way, every one of you will be a servant and slave of authorities, public bodies and governments, or of those people in power and their vassals who possess power in this respect. Still, in the early part of the third millennium, there might be time for you human beings of Earth to prevent this if you would unify as humanity and rise up against these threatening future machinations of governments and the scientists and technicians who obey them, in order to prevent the threat named in this regard from occurring. Overpopulation on Earth, it must be said again and again, will continue to rise due to the senselessness and the irresponsibility of your humanity of Earth. However, this also happens due to the machinations of governments, their authorities and public bodies which promote offspring and act with equal levels of irresponsibility, as well as the sectarian stupidities of the Catholic Church, which can indeed be called criminal and unlawful, or else those of the Pope, clerics and priests who are misty-hing the go forth and multiply as a deceitful law of God. As a result, there will be ever more human beings who will have less and less space in which to live, and this space will become so small that you will end up by trampling one another to death. And you will move about more and more, spilling over the boundaries of your home country and leaving it, thereby dying, although very many of you will also travel the world aimlessly, with the consequence that you will intermix and form liaisons more and more, leading to increasing numbers of families being torn apart and more mixed-race peoples arising, whilst pure peoples disappear to an increasing extent. As a result, however, you will become more and more foreign to one another, with the consequence that more and more hatred and enmities will arise, which will in turn lead to ever more conflicts between individuals and ultimately to death, manslaughter, criminality and wars with destructions full of Gewalt. Therefore, many of you will lapse into depravity, meaning that you will lose your own guidance, spread in all directions and go from one misfortune to the next. And as a result of the religions, sects, ideologies and philosophies that have lapsed into falseness and lying as well as deception and untruthfulness, you human beings of Earth are initially going even further astray and following the creational laws and recommendations even less, in order to live far from them and not to adhere to them. And indeed it will take a long time, because this is the way that people act, and you only want to guide your life according to your own laws, completely beyond the laws and recommendations as they have been given through the creation that anchored everything in ancient times and the nature and the entire existence of the universe. In the way that you disregard and scorn the creational laws and recommendations, it will also be that you treat the natural guidance of nature into the ground to such an extent that women only continue to give birth to offspring whose sex has been determined in advance through selective precautions taken during conception, which will increasingly no longer be performed in a natural way, but artificially. It will also be the case and become the norm that in the case of natural conceptions, the embryo in the womb will be unscrupulously killed for no vital reason if its sex does not correspond to the wish of the mother or the father. In future time, it will be the case that very many of you human beings of Earth will think yourselves as creation itself in your religious, sectarian sense as God. The powerful ones of all kinds amongst you will seize ever more land and property and other belongings for themselves, including women, whom they will keep as prostitutes or as objects of prestige. Whereas the powerful ones amongst you will increasingly view the poor and weak as subhuman and as vermin, and will treat them accordingly, so that you who belong to this class will increasingly live in fear, and the hatred in you will assume its most poisonous forms. However, all the items named here only represent the start, because in secret there is a mighty organization of the governing class and powerful people, as well as many of their obedient lackeys emerging from amongst your humanity, who are creating a secret order of darkness with their own evil laws and ordinances, who are bent on hatred for the poor and weak and against the economically imprisoned and all normal citizens.